Hi, second grade. We are going to finish the story, The Mackinac Bridge, today. Before we start jumping into the end of the story, The Mackinac Bridge, I wanted to show you some real pictures of the Mackinac Bridge. This is a real bridge in Michigan. The story is fiction, but the bridge is real, and it's a really long bridge, as you can see in the pictures. So I wanted to show you this so you have an image in your head of what it really looks like as we're finishing up our story today. So where we left off, Mark and his brother Luke were excited about the bridge being built. Luke was even working for the bridge, but Mark and Luke's dad, who's a ferry boat driver, he was feeling worried about the bridge going up because that might mean that the people don't need his ferry anymore and he wouldn't be able to keep his job. So let's read the rest of the story to see what happens with the Mackinac Bridge and Luke's family today. Mark read everything he could find about the bridge. He read about David Steinman, the engineer who designed the Mackinac Bridge and was supervising its building. Mr. Steinman designed and built bridges all over the world. He wrote poetry too. He said the Mackinac Bridge would be, quote, a poem stretched across the straits. Next summer, Mark would be working full-time on the ferry. He decided he would save his money and go to engineering school. While the snow crept down from the roof of their house and up from the ground, closing off the windows, Mark imagined himself in the steamy jungles of Brazil, building bridges across the Amazon River. In the spring of 1956, the bridgemen made a catwalk of 2 wires on each side of the bridge. They draped the wires over the 2 towers in a graceful curve. Chain link fencing was placed between the wires. The catwalk would allow the workers to spin the cables that would hold up the bridge. Luke came home. "I walked it," he shouted. "I walked right across the bridge on the catwalk." Mark saw his mom shiver as she looked out at the narrow pathway 500 feet in the air. "I guess it's time for me to look for a new job," Captain Hansen said. A necklace of lights was strung up along the catwalk for the bridgemen who were working around the clock. Mark dreamed he was alone up on the catwalk, so close to the moon and stars he could touch them. All summer long, wheels like giant spiders crept back and forth across the bridge, stringing wires. Mark could hear the cowbells on the wheels warning the men on the catwalk to get out of the way. There were over 12,000 strands of wire in each cable. The cables had to be strong, for they would hold up the floor of the bridge. Captain Hansen said, "I heard they're going to chop the top off of one of the ferries and use it as a barge. I'd sink the Aurora before I'd let them do that to her." Remember, the Aurora is the ferry boat that Captain Hansen is the captain of. That winter, an offer came for the ferry. When the bridge was completed, the Aurora would be sent downstate to the Detroit River. "At least it will still be carrying cars," the captain said. "What about you, Dad?" Mark asked. "What will you do?" "I've got a pretty good offer from a company whose ferries go from Mackinac City to Mackinac Island." "That's great, Dad," Mark said, but he couldn't help thinking of how small those Mackinac Island ferries were. You could put a couple of them inside the Aurora. The April of 1957 brought one of the strait's worst storms. 70-mile-an-hour gusts bent the trees and stacked ice as high as skyscrapers. When the gulls returned later in the spring, the bridge still stood. That summer, the shores were crowded with cheering people. They had come to watch the roadway lifted onto its steel support and attached to the fringe of wire that hung down from the cables. At last, the lower and upper peninsulas were joined. Mark's heart was going so fast he could hardly breathe. There was still a lot to do to meet the November 1st deadline. The roadways had to be paved and the bridge painted. Now, when Luke went to work, their mom packed dinner for him as well as lunch. Sometimes he didn't get home until midnight. Sometimes he worked all night. Captain Hansen was working long hours as well. He was polishing all the bright work on the Aurora and giving her deck a new coat of paint. "I want to be proud of the boat I send downstate," he said. He gave the ferry a loving pat. Mark jumped out of bed. It was the 1st of November. Today, the bridge would be open to traffic. Michigan's governor was going to lead the parade. Schools had been given the day off. Hundreds of cars would be crossing the bridge. Just as Mark and Luke were leaving, the captain said, "I hope you're not planning to cross that bridge without your mother and me." That night, there was a celebration with fireworks. Mark and Luke and their mom and dad watched from the deck of the Aurora. The sparks from the fireworks tangled with the light from the bridge. When the fireworks were over, Captain Hansen brought the ferry boat home for its last trip on the Straits. Later, after everyone was asleep, Mark crept out of the house. It was warm for November. He walked the mile from their house to the Straits. The string of lights glittered on the deserted bridge. Mark was sure that somewhere there was a river wider than the Straits, and he would build the bridge that crossed it. That is the end of the story.